Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Rick Belluzzo.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? So a funny story kind of behind this is, Rob contacted me, I don't know how long ago, about doing this. And so we went back and forth a bit, and I agreed to a date, and I picked a date way out into the future. And I thought I would practice a technique I learned in my career, which is just-in-time worrying. And what that basically means is when you have to do a lot of speeches and presentations, it doesn't do any good to start preparing too soon, because it's just incredibly inefficient, because you worry, you think, and you're just as effective, if not more effective, waiting till the last minute, which is not my style, but waiting till the last minute, working hard, being prepared, and having the energy to do a good job. So that's what I thought this was all about. It turns out not to have worked that way, because the topic of culture is incredibly difficult to talk about. And in fact, if you go around and ask people, you'll get people to say, culture is really important. Then you click down the next layer and you go, well, what does that mean to you? And people start to struggle. And then they go, well, how do you drive your culture? What is your culture? Why is it important? And the whole thing kind of falls apart. And so what I tried to do here is put together a conversation, and I really look forward to the Q&A, because I think that's the best part to really get clarity, that can kind of take you through my journey of culture, what I've learned, the principles I've learned. And then I've got one segment where if I were to start a company today, what are the cultural principles that I would pursue and why? And that's hard when I don't know what industry I'm in, because you'll hear they need to be aligned. And then talk practically about, if you're a CEO, how do you make sure you're pursuing your vision of a culture appropriately? So I'm going to try to cover all of that, I don't know, in just over 30 minutes, I guess, without PowerPoint, because I decided in my point of career I'm not going to do PowerPoint anymore, even though I worked at Microsoft. And so it's just going to be a conversation. And I got to warn you, I think the cultural message is universal. I think it works for young companies, old companies, startups, mature companies. I think the principles are the same. I know they're mostly young companies here, but I'm not young. And so the examples and the stories I may tell may be totally incoherent to some of you, because of the amount of time I've been in the industry. But try a little bit. You might pick up something through the process. So that's what we're going to do, if that sounds okay. Okay. So let's start. I could do this as a group, but we don't have time to do that. Is to define what culture really means in a company. What culture really means. And I believe that every company and every organization has a culture. Just like when people say to a business, you don't have a strategy, everyone has one. It may not be good, it may not be coherent, it may not have been thought through, it may not be managed, it may be unsuccessful or whatever, but a culture exists. And I like to think about it as like a magnetic field that draws people together around decisions, behavior, actions, that natural things happen within an organization because the culture, as it's defined, as it's been practiced, as it's developed, causes it to occur. Now, that can be very well thought through so that your strategy, your culture, your team, things are aligned and things reinforce each other as you move through running your business. Or they may be in conflict, or they may be accidental, or they may be driven by the industry. I don't know. But you have a culture. Where you work has a culture. People behave a certain way. They do things a certain way. They have certain rules in their mind of how you solve problems and how you run a business. And I think most CEOs, most places, my last role, I was only an interim CEO for 7 months. And everyone said to me, I'll talk about it later, you need to address the culture. And I go, well, I can't, I'm just the interim guy. I can't address the culture. But I learned that the value and the principle of culture is important. And I thought a little bit and talked to some people, how do you do this thing, address the culture? And what most people do is they get a bunch of top performers in the company, they put them in a room together and say, here, you guys come up with our culture, and they come up with a checklist of 12 items. And it's everything like be honest, do good. I mean, all these different things that it's so large and so complex, it's really not usable. And that's where I find most places occur. So the first point I would make here today is if you're a CEO, you want to start a company, you're founding a company, it's your job, nobody else's job, but your job to, just as you're responsible for the strategy of the company, you're responsible for defining the culture that is part of that strategy. Can't be delegated to a team, can't be delegated to a consultant. You have to own it. You can use get all sorts of help and use all sorts of tools, but you have to own the culture, because it is a significant factor in the development of your organization and success. You believe that? You buy into that? Okay, I'll try to. You'll understand that more maybe here as we go along. So let me take you through my journey, and there are journeys in big companies and small companies and different experiences. And tell you, and then when I take you through some of these, I'll tell you some stories and get to. I'm going to go through what are the lessons, therefore, that those things taught me. Maybe not relevant to your experience, but it is relevant to what they taught me. So I started at HP. I was at HP for 23 years. I started really young, right out of school. And as one of my partners in Italy, who also worked at HP, said to me, you're really an HP guy. And what that means is, there's certain cultural principles that I grew up with and when I was young, and ultimately became kind of part of my fabric. So wherever I go, whatever I do, I still kind of bring that with me. I still kind of behave and react to problems kind of the same way. And that's important. It's important to know about yourself, because a culture should also be somewhat aligned with you. I would also say during my time at HP, and I mean Hewlett-Packard, I mean the one that used to exist, not the one that's been divided 2 or 3 times, and all of that. So you got to work with me on that. Probably had the most developed notion of a culture that I've experienced ever since. It was called the HP Way. There were a bunch of things that meant to people. We behaved a certain way. And you'll find cultures can be strong and they can be weak. And HP was a strong culture. Strong cultures are good and strong cultures are bad, because if strong cultures are good when they're working, when they're aligned with the strategy, when they're aligned with the market, they're bad when they're not. But HP had a strong culture. And one evidence of that was every time we hired a high-level manager from outside, they failed, right? Because you kind of had to grow up in the culture to really know how to operate. Now, for guys like me, I didn't notice that. I didn't know. I just thought that's the way it was. But as I had more experiences and looked back, I learned that the culture really, when you're young and you're learning, it really becomes a part of who you are. It's interesting, though, in the stories that I'll tell, when you talk about culture, many people will talk about the demise of some of these companies to be related to their culture. So many people said that the HP culture was no longer a competitive culture. I would argue that the HP culture deviated, it evolved, it changed in a way that moved away from the center of what it was initially meant to be. And I'll use that a little bit in my example, but it somehow got interpreted later on that it was all very much about a feel-good culture, that you didn't argue with people, you didn't confront people, you were always very teamwork and all kind. And that was not the HP way. In fact, my experiences were just the opposite. I found it to be a very performance tough culture with a soft, respectful edge to it. But somehow it shifted. So for whatever reason, people will tell you when I could say, for sure, I've talked to her, when Carly Fiorina went in to take over the company, and this is just after I left, she would criticize the culture as not being a competitive culture. And I personally believe the culture wavered over time and lost its effectiveness, but it was a very strong culture. So I learned a lot there. That's been a big part of it. Then I went to SGI. We worked together at SGI, right? So, SGI, I learned a different lesson. SGI had, and some of you, just a quick story. I have a guy I'm on the board with, and he works at Facebook, and he said when he was interviewing for the job, he told Zuckerberg, I worked at SGI, and he said, who's SGI? So I realize that it's a company that's come and gone. Some of you may not recognize it, but that culture was very much about innovation. Innovation at all costs. Take any risk you have to take. Do the most interesting product possible. And it was almost, what I learned at SGI is while a culture needs to be defined in a focused way, there have to be multiple elements to it. And SGI was so focused on innovation that when it applied that to certain markets, it didn't work. For example, SGI was a leader in desktop graphics that don't exist anymore, but there used to be special desktop computers that were graphics computers that were used for design and animation in some of these areas, and that market has been obliterated. That was, SGI could build the fastest, best products in that area. But the PC came along, right, and the PC was becoming increasingly more capable. Well, SGI tried to pivot and build a PC with kind of SGI-like graphics, and it totally failed because the PC market, couldn't really handle too much innovation, right? The innovation, there was a standard you had to build by. So SGI couldn't keep up with the development cycle. So this is when the PC market was really innovating every 6 months or so. SGI couldn't keep up, because they were always focused on innovation, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. Didn't work in the PC market. So that was the second lesson, was in that case, the culture does need to be more versatile and narrow, but not too narrow and not too broad, and you have to find the right balance, and we'll talk more about that. Then I went to Microsoft. I was recruited out of there to go to Microsoft. Of course, that is the most unusual culture to this day that I've ever experienced, and we could talk about it forever. But one of the premier, a little bit like SGI, they had a very dominant cultural perspective, and that is that we never give up. We solely can go after a market, and we can just keep going after the market, do what it takes to become a market leader. That was the perspective, the cultural norm. And so what that meant was the company strategically tended to go after things that were proven markets, where there was a leader in place, and go and try to dislodge that leader out of pure innovation, hustle, investment, whatever. And you can, any of you who've been around can think of the examples where that's the case, whether it's in search, whether it was in the online business, which I ran, whether it's in mobility, a number of areas where Microsoft tried that cultural element and it didn't work. But it had worked before, and it was hard. It became such a big part of the culture. When I went to Microsoft to run the consumer business, I was a good example of it. I took over 16 businesses, and we were losing a tremendous amount of money. I mean, I can't even tell you how much money we were losing in these different parts of the company. And so my mission was, you got to go fix this problem. So I started going through it. After a period of time, I said, we're going to have 4 programs, not 16. We're going to have 4. And you're either going to fit the technologies and the offerings are either going to fit within those 4 in a cohesive way, or we're going to close it, sell it, we're going to get rid of it. And so my first shot at that was dealing with the online tax, or it wasn't online, the tax software business. Intuit, massively dominated that market. We were late. We were going at it like everyone. And I remember the guy came in and said, I need 16 more developers. And I said, well, how are you going to turn this around with 16 developers? And I found it, and I used this as my first opportunity. I said, well, I have a more fundamental decision here. I think we should just get out of the business. Team was devastated. They couldn't believe that. We'll reallocate people, but we're not going to be in that business. It's too late. It's going to go online. Intuit dominates. We're going to move on. We're going to give up and move on. And I remember Steve Ballmer, got wind of this. He came into my office, and he just says, he goes, I know you're new. He said, but we don't give up. And I go, Steve, I can't do miracle. I can't do 16 miracles. I can't do 16 miracles. We've got to look ahead. And we had this big debate, and he finally said, okay, I'm going to go with you on this one, but we don't give up. And I had 2 or 3 more that we did. We went through and made changes on, but it was culturally very, very challenging. But again, that was a very strong cultural element that worked for a while, and then it struggled. The next experience was at Quantum. Here it was a transformation. Here's where a company is going from a big divestiture of its core business, a remaining business, and a remaining set of assets that needed to transition into something new. That transition was big. It was big. It was from hardware to software. It was from OEM, storage devices to OEM to end user enterprise selling. It was from tape drives to do backups to deduplicated disk systems and all this stuff. Very hard transformation culturally. Skill set, the way processes are run. Another experience that talked about how important to me culture was. The next one is Viavi, which was recent now, Viavi Solutions. I stepped in as interim CEO. And I started to observe, and everyone started talking about culture again. There was another different problem, is that we were a company that probably did about 20 acquisitions. And we didn't have, we had a culture, as I said, but it wasn't clear what it was. Maybe we had 20 cultures, I don't know. But we were not able to come together. And because of that, of course, there's a whole bunch of problems that come along with it. So, these are all experiences that, again, talk about how important culture is. And then in my experience with startups, I see the beginning of it all, where a strong CEO steps in with the CEO's personality, and the culture starts to get built around that personality and who the CEO is. And I see mistakes. I see things that I try to reinforce. So when I talk about the things I would do, I'll share some of those with you. In fact, I've got one company I'm involved with. I had a talk. I just recently joined, as chairman. I invested in the company. Our firm invested in the company. And I started to coach him already. I said, you got to think about that. I appreciate all the positive inputs, but we also got to talk about problems. That's a cultural thing, right? And which a lot of startups, I think, struggle with, because everybody wants to be successful. So it's good to talk about the successes, but we also have to talk about the challenges. So those are, I could go on and on about these cultural experiences, but they're all quite profound. And to me, as I've prepared for this talk over the months that I've been thinking about this now, I would say I've learned in my reflection that culture is even more important than I thought it was. And it needs to be addressed in a way that is coherent. It's the CEO's job. It's really fundamental to success. So now with that, let me just quickly go through some of the lessons that come from that. So that the first one I just mentioned is cultural. Culture is fundamental, and it has to be a part of your strategy. The culture and the strategy have to be aligned. Because if they're not, then of course you're working counter purposes to itself. So if you're in a marketplace, for example, that is really cost focused, and you've got to squeeze every nickel and dime out of things, then you have to have a culture that's like that, right? You don't have a culture of people flying first class and having big offices and all that. I mean, you have to align the whole mentality that we save every dime we can possibly save in order to align our culture and strategies. It's really important. If it's about innovation, whatever aspect it is, culture is critical. It matters. Remember, it's this magnetic field that pulls you somewhere, so you want to define where it's pulling you. And you want to do it in a way that's consistent with what you have to do to be successful in the industry you're in. That seems logical, but I don't think I've ever seen a startup proposal that talks about culture either. No one ever thinks about it in advance, and they start having behaviors that don't fit the kind of culture they really want to have because they haven't really thought about it. So I think you can think about it early, and you can work on documenting and setting a vision for what kind of company you want to be, what kind of culture you want to be, not just what you want to do, but what kind of company, what kind of culture do you want to be. The second point is changing a culture. Because I've heard that phrase a lot too. Oh, you've got to change the culture. That's really hard. It's really hard to change a culture. And I think the reason a lot of the companies, in the Valley here come and go is because they can't change the culture fast enough or extreme enough to meet the new demands of a market. So my advice there is the culture has to be dynamic. Is a hard switch. And when we talk about the things you have to do to build a culture, you look at it and you say, I can't change the organization overnight. I can't hire and fire the whole team overnight. But those are all the elements to a large extent that help determine your culture. And so you need to think about the culture as being dynamic, and don't get yourself in a position where you're forced to have to deal with a major cultural change, because it's hard to do. It takes time, and you may not have that much time. I even told people as a board member, this is the strategy you want to pursue. This is the culture. Maybe instead of picking the strategy first, maybe you ought to acknowledge the culture you have and pick a strategy that fits your culture. Reverse the thinking. Because if you're, the Olympics are going on today, if you're a sprinter, don't do a long distance run. I mean, don't fool yourself. Don't repart yourself. Do what you do well. And don't be unrealistic about how much change you have to put yourself through. So that's the second lesson learned. The third one is, as I said earlier, culture has to be focused, not 12 items, but it can't be one item. So you really have to think about, what do you want to stand out in your culture? Because your cultural kind of objective doesn't have to be everything. I find people feel the need to say, we're going to have integrity and be honest. Well, let's just accept that. Maybe in some industries you have to call that out. Or we're going to have a quality product. Or maybe you just have to say, that's just a table stakes. We're going to have a quality product. So my point is, there's a lot of important things, but don't get so wrapped up in being totally thorough on everything you want to be, and miss the fact that to build a culture, you've got to have a few things that really stand out. Not one, because there's too much interaction sometimes. But you have to have focus and passion in what you think is going to be the most important part of the culture that you pursue. Related to that is the interaction between cultural principles is important. Sometimes they feel like they conflict. And so, I have a phrase, I wrote a book on this, and I have a phrase as one of the 5 things I would do of being hard-headed and soft-hearted. That was always the problem at HP. People couldn't figure that out. How can you be hard, tough-minded on performance and be soft-hearted? There's these conflicts, but the conflicts are real. And and part of building your culture is to be able to have a way that you can manage through the conflicts. I remember once, this is an HP story. I remember once when I was it was a marketing manager, my first job as a marketing manager, and we introduced a storage product that didn't work. Small item. We sold a lot of them, and it didn't work. It was a disaster. And, we introduced it because we were under pressure to introduce a product. So we had a time to market goal, but we weren't there on the quality side. And people kind of closed their eyes to that or whatever. It was a bad situation. And I remember an executive came from Palo Alto to where we were in Boise, Idaho, where we had that operation. And it was a teaching moment. It was like, okay, you guys have really stepped on it here. You couldn't manage these trade-offs very well. Time to market leadership, quality, customer satisfaction. You screwed it all up. And he helped clarify, what was important. It was things like, we are not going to lose a single customer over this. I don't care what you have to do. Preserving our customers and meeting our commitments is a number 1 attribute. I don't care what you have to give them, what you have to do, but that's important. Number 2, we're not going to ship a bad product. So, we're going to announce this product's coming off the market until you get it. I mean, it was a series of things like that. And it was all, again, this interaction between these trade-offs that is part of the cultural experience of building the kind of company that you want to build. Let's see. The 5th point I had on lesson learned is that cultures can wander. You don't even know they're wandering, but they wander. And then that was the story in HP. And then finally, as I mentioned below, the CEO is really critical. You can't delegate this responsibility. You can get help, but you can't just say this is a soft skill that someone needs to go do. You got to personally own what kind of company you want to be. And so that is really critical. Okay, let me, I'm running short of time. I thought I was going to have plenty of time here. But let me go through what I would do if I were starting a company today. What are the 5, and I picked 5, not 12, not 1, not 2, but these are 5 important things that I would want my company to rally around as a place to build a really world-class successful company. Now, I say that carefully because I don't know what industry I'm in, right? So this is a bit theoretical, but let me take a shot at it. The first one is I would want to build a performance culture. A performance culture that's based on external reality. And have accountability in the organization for making mistakes or for falling short of this external requirement. And I would want to do it in a way that, of course, makes people stronger over time. Now, those are a lot of words. But what I mean by that is I see so many startups and so many companies where people get delusional. They go, oh, we had a great quarter. Why did you have a great quarter? Because we did this. Well, what did the competition do? Oh, well, they did better. Well, why did they do better? You want to be able to have it so your team is willing to talk about the hard facts about performance, where people are measuring up and where they're not, and what you're going to do about it. It's a performance culture of getting results, and people shouldn't be punished if they're not. I mean, I've seen too many CEOs who want success so bad that they almost order it, and people hide then because they're afraid to say they didn't, that they're, or they make excuses and all that stuff feels very bad. So I would want a culture where we could all sit down and say, we want to get performance. We want to be the best in the industry, and we're going to compare ourselves to the outside world, and we're going to work together to face off on these tasks. Yeah, I remember I was at the World Economic Forum many years ago, and I heard a CEO say something I thought was profound. He said, he was a French guy. It says, when something goes wrong in my company, I start with the point of view that it's my fault. And I thought, how empowering would that be if the CEO, instead of looking for blame, starts off by saying, I'm the CEO, it's my fault. Now let's start there and let's work and get better. So performance culture works to get better, works to learn, holds people accountable, and I would want that, and does it based on not fantasy, but based on the external reality of what's going on, not defensive. Okay? So that's point number one. Number two, I would really want to build a team environment. And I know that's simple words, but I mean, where boundaries just didn't matter so much, the levels didn't manage so much. Now, that's weird because I worked in big companies, and big companies are always worried about, what seat you're sitting at, and, what level, your title, and all that. But I would want a company that to build a culture where that didn't matter. The venture firm I work with today, we all have the same title. Everyone has the same title. We're all partners. We're a small firm. We don't have any offices. You go to our offices in Milan, and we have just tables where people put their computers and work, and we have conference rooms where we meet companies. And why is because we have the sense that we're a small partnership, and we're going to make decisions together. We're sharing the success, we share in the failure, and we're going to, we're not going to create distinctions between us. If I have to help somebody in another area, in another company, in another field, I'll do it. If they, there's no boundaries, there's no layers. It's working together as a team around a set of objectives. And everyone will talk about teamwork, but they won't usually, in most bigger companies, talk about it in that way. That really changes. We have, I in my short time at Viavi, I started changing the rules. Anything that had to do with level. If you're this level, you get to fly business class. You can't because I said, levels won't matter in any of this. None of our policy, who has offices, none of that stuff. It's about need. It's about what's best for the company. It's what the team needs to be successful. That shakes up a lot of people. But if you're starting a company, I think this is much easier for startups. If you're starting a company, think about it that way. Third point is innovation. Innovation, and it really kind of, what I say, suspends disbelief, because I've been around long enough that every hard and fast principle that this is the way it is turns out to be wrong at some point in time. And if you're on the wrong side of that, you're in big trouble. And if you have cultures that say, who would have thought that, that system architectures were going to be defined by cloud providers and not system companies? Who would have thought of that? That's the most insane thing I ever heard of. That's what's happening today. I could go on and on. And so, so I would want a culture that we never say anyone's stupid for having a crazy idea to do something, because that's the kind of culture and environment we want to have. The fourth point is the phrase I use, the hard-headed and soft-hearted part. I have a whole long story about my interaction with Dave Packard, the founder of HP, and I don't have time for. But hard-headed and soft-hearted is simply that we are going to be tough-minded in our ethics, in the way we do our job, in the performance we expect from people, from all of us, and we're going to treat people with respect at the same time, and that's where the heart comes in. That's true for our community. It's true for our partnerships, our relationships. We're going to make commitments, and we're going to meet commitments. We're going to be known as people who follow through on what they say they're going to do. When I was when I was a junior woodchuck at HP, I was a finance guy, and I remember I had my first proposal to the executive committee, the CEO and everything. And I worked with a team to come up with some. I don't even remember the proposal. And I went in that meeting and we made our proposal, and we just got our heads handed to us. It was viewed so badly. it was viewed as like the stupidest proposal, and it was I felt it was like, I'm a young guy here. I felt like it was somewhat abusive to be called stupid. I know worked at Microsoft where it happens all the time, but it was just shocking to me, and I was just terribly demoralized. I felt I was ready to quit. I go, what is this HP way thing? I mean, it was brutal. And the next day I was moaning around, I was over in the coffee station, and one of the leaders of the pack that kind of attacked us, Paul Healy was his name, he came up and put his arm around me. And he says, well, let's talk. And it was like, that was the soft-hearted part of what I had the day before, where I needed to learn a lesson, and then I needed to be rebuilt. And the guy worked on both halves of that. You know what I mean? And so that was an amazing thing. I had so many stories on hard-headed and soft-hearted, but you understand the point. Is I don't want to have an abusive culture. I want to treat people with respect, and yet I don't want to be soft-headed either, where poor performance goes on and you miss dates, and that's not at all what I mean. And then the fifth point is the kind of communication that's tough in today's world, but to be incredibly open and transparent as I possibly could be. I want to say all of our team are smart people who want to be successful and who should get as much information as they can get so that we can all work as a team to get the job done. So you see all of those things, you can see where you have trade-offs, right? Where you have to have performance, and you've got to treat people with respect, and you've got to have integrity. I mean, all these things require interaction. So I will close by saying now, what does all this mean? If you're the CEO, how do you go about dealing with building your culture? The first one is your policies, procedures, behavior, all these things have to match your culture. So for example, if you say I have a culture that's really open, people communicate freely, then you don't do what we did at Microsoft, which we all had individual offices, right? I mean, that sounds like a small thing, but it's a big thing. You know, we would send emails to each other, you know, one door away from each other. We wouldn't really interact or talk. And that's fine, but if your culture's to be something else, you got to have policies and procedures, the way you pay people, the way you do all these things. You have to be aligned with what your culture is. Leadership really matters, and you learn that the hard way. Leaders, you can't say this is our culture, but I'm going to behave differently. You got to be in line with not only defining it, but living it. I remember, you know, when we had tough times. I use the example of the business class travel. You know, people complain. I said, you know, I'm flying economy too. I'm the CEO, but I'm going to fly economy too, because that's what we're doing as a team. So leadership in reinforcing your culture matters, or I'm willing to do what I have to do to be successful to help the team. Your hiring, of course, has to be consistent. You've heard, does this person fit the culture? Well, I don't know how you know that if you haven't defined what your culture is. I can't, how many times, it doesn't fit the culture. So what does that mean? What doesn't fit? And people get kind of stumped. So it's important that you have a culture defined and you hire to meet that culture. And then finally, that you communicate and you teach through tough experiences. As a CEO, you have to be a teacher as well. I'll end with that one story back at HP, which there was this culture at HP that you could make a mistake. And it was an empowering culture because you didn't want to make a mistake, but you knew you could take risks. And I can remember when I ran the inkjet printer business, and we made a change to the rollers. We were growing like crazy, and we were doing everything we could to improve the manufacturing efficiency. And so someone changed the material in these rollers that picked up the paper. If any of you still use printers, that pick up the paper. And what happened is after a while, they wouldn't pick up paper anymore, which isn't a good thing. And so we were like trying to sort out how to deal with it. We had millions of these products out there, and I remember the guy came to the board. There was a board meeting that day, and they said, "Rick, you need to explain to the board the impact of this change and of this problem." I go, "Oh, cool," you know. So I went and did this matrix of the failure rate and we could cost the failure. It could cost up to $40 million, which is nothing today, but back then was a lot of money. And I had it all in, and I go in there and I'm gonna present it, and I go through this thing, and I remember Bill Hewlett interrupted me in the middle of it. And he says, "Rick, this is all really interesting, but I have, you know, just two comments. One is the same comment I had before was, you're going to get this right by our customers. Whatever it takes, you get this right by our customers. And number two is, what lesson have you learned from this mistake?" You know, it was a teaching moment. But you'll have a lot of chances, believe me, as a CEO, to be hard-headed, soft-hearted, expect performance. I mean, do all these things and teach your team and build towards this culture that you want to build, because you believe that's the most successful culture for the business that you're trying to build. I'll stop there, and we will open it up for questions.
We're going to start with Q&A, and I'll start with the first question. In Silicon Valley, in startup ecosystem, there's a mantra: failure's okay, fail fast. And we see so many startups at our events, and they just keep failing and failing and failing. So is that a bad thing that this is embraced so ubiquitously, and some people keep failing forever? At some point, they
no,
just
I think it's a bad thing. I mean, I don't know. I'm not. You know, I spend most of my time in places where we can't fail too much because we don't have enough money, and if we fail, we're out of business. Just remember, someone who's been through the cycles, that all sounds really good in a world of heavy funding and large resource, capital available, but that's usually not the case. It's been that way for a while, long while, but usually you don't have that option. So I think there's balance. Again, I think all these things have balance. I think the point of failing is you don't want people to be so afraid of failing that they don't make decisions, they don't take risks, and they hide things. If you create an environment that's, if you make a mistake, you get your head chewed off, and you get fired or whatever, other people watch that and they all start going, "Oh, I'm going to be," that's what you don't want to have. You want to have an environment that's open and interacting. But I would say if you keep failing, then you get down to the performance, factor, which is, again, this is a trade-off. This is a judgment. That's why CEOs' jobs are important, is because you have to make those decisions across those different factors.
Yeah, we have a question over here.
Hi, my name is Vida, and I have a question regarding can we teach people the culture, or we have to choose people who fit to the culture? And I'm not talking about the big companies. I'm talking about a startup. For example, if I want to have a startup and I want to choose 4 or 5 people as a team member, so it's hard for me. For example, I see people that can't implement my idea in 2 days, in 1 month, but I see they are not accountable. They don't keep their promise. And it's hard for me to work with them, but they are people that they can deliver this product in 1 year, but culturally then they can fit to what I want.
Yeah. So the answer is it's a little bit of both, in that you're hiring people who are largely inexperienced around working in organizations, right? So you take risks in hiring talent, and you work to teach them. But once you reach the point where you say, "I can't teach what's important here," you have to make a change. And I think that's this hard-headed and soft-hearted point. So you can't agonize over hiring, saying, "I've got to get the perfect person," and never hire anyone, or wait too long, because then you fail, right? So you've got to take some risk. You've got to bring people in with you believe has the right capability. You have to hopefully have a strong culture that people can blend into and build, and you teach them that. And that will work a lot but it won't always work. And when it doesn't work, you've got to deal with it, because in a small team, when there's a cultural renegade that's too far off the map, it could be really destructive. And so that is, that would be my advice. Again, it's not cut and dry. It requires kind of leadership to assess the situation. And it's the hardest, I will tell you as a CEO, that's the hardest decisions I've ever had to make, is when I have my executive team now, and I have one person who's, who I've got to deal with that. I've never been very good at that. And yet I would say, because it's the hardest decision you have to make. And when I've made them, I've always said, damn it, I should have made that decision earlier. So you have to follow your judgment on the person after you have some experience.
Hello, my name is Tito Bort. My question is in regards to companies scaling and going global, because definitely, different cities, different countries have different internal cultures. The laid back culture in California, or like completely different culture, let's say in Europe or South America. How important is it to keep a same culture across the globe for a global company? And are there different methods that would be implemented? Yeah.
That's a good observation. I would say more than you think, the cultures need to be there. The elements of the cultures need to be span globally, and certainly there are local interpretations and local things that might be different. But the culture itself, it needs to be global. If it's not global, if there's an element of it that's not global, then it's probably not a good element. People used to always say, again, if whether it was HP or Microsoft, when you traveled around the world, which I did, you knew you were in an HP or Microsoft office. I mean, you knew it. The way the vocabulary even was the same. So I think it has to be global. It has to be global. And I've also I've been involved in a situation recently with a company which went the other way, built very geographically dispersed teams, and it didn't work. I mean, I don't believe it. It didn't work. So I believe the culture needs to be global, needs to span globally, it needs to work globally, and there's some adaptations that represent local culture, local custom, but don't overdo that.
Any tips on the emergence of a new office opening somewhere, and just how to align that new place with the previous culture? Because
previous culture.
Right. Let's say you have an office in New York, you're opening one in California. How do you make sure the culture emerging in California fits the New York office? Because it's usually culture when you're a small company, it's like emerging, it's like the leadership right there. So would you try to feed people from one place to the other? And
I would make everything as similar as it could be. I would definitely have a lot of interchange of talent and ideas, and so I think you have to think of it as though it's not in another place. It's just an extension. It's part of the company. I don't know if that makes sense, but you can't let things divert. If they diverge, something is wrong. And yes, there are local customs. So in New York, people may start later in the day and work later at night than they do in California. They may start earlier in the day. I mean, there are certainly things like that. No big deal. That's custom. But culture needs to be transformative across the environment.
First, thank you for being here and sharing with us a little bit of your life story. My question is, what do you think is that one thing that successful leaders have in common?
One thing successful leaders have in common. I don't know if there's one thing. I think the most important, probably, if I look back on what I have found as being the most important, is to have the right team, is to recruit the right people, and to make sure that team is a team. And when that's been good, the results have tended to be good. And if you have one team member that's not holding up, or that's, the whole team fails. So I think it's around the recruiting the best talent and providing the clearest direction to that talent and dealing with misalignments when they exist.
Hi, my name is Madhav Reddy, and my background's in the pharma and life sciences space, and there's a strong component of never making mistakes. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about prevailing pharma culture and then what impact that has.
Well, that's a little different, yeah. That's why I said it's important for your culture and your strategy and industry to match. So clearly, when you're in healthcare, there has to be a strong cultural element about people's lives and how you ensure that you're doing good. So I would only say that has to be a big part of your culture, that you're, that no failure there is acceptable. And so that would be a dominant element of the culture. But you also probably have to think about innovation, and you have to think about a few other things. But that has to be a part of it. Where some of the stuff we do, if the product doesn't work, we get yelled at, but nobody loses a life. And so that clearly has to be a part of aligning your culture with what you're trying to accomplish.
My question is a little more on the theoretical side of things. So I recently heard a Stanford evolutionary psychologist say that culture is kind of one of those innate fundamental things in human nature that kind of is part of our success. That makes me think that the innate elements of it ties to things like cognitive biases. My question is, do you think if unmanaged culture there's like a default culture that forms?
Oh, I do think so. Yeah, I do. That's the point I tried to make earlier. I think every organization has a culture, and that culture will build and develop like an organism. I mean, it will build and develop. If managed or unmanaged, it will build and develop. Because there are aspects, I assure you, there are aspects in companies' cultures that nobody would have ever wanted to have developed. And yet they happened. So there was some consequence of a certain pattern that created a culture, let's say, of being overly political or overly hierarchical or lacking integrity and I mean, those are bad things. That something happened to cause that to be allowed as part of the culture.
My question is more, are there certain tendencies toward hierarchy in politics? Or do you think it really is just kind of based on that startup story?
No, I don't know what the tendencies are, but I wouldn't doubt that, and I think it would vary on where in the world you were and the age of the organization and a number of things, the broader culture around, because I also find as I travel the world that there's countries that have cultures too. And you don't come to work and leave your personal life behind. So there are aspects to that carry through. So I think there are factors. I don't know what they are. I mean, I would say in Italy, trying to start companies in Italy in an environment that can make the most amazing. I have this great story because I'm Italian. I can say this. When it comes to administrative things in Italy, it's just a disaster. It's culturally, whether it's the government, whether it's the company, I just can't find a company that it's not just difficult. And everyone has a reason why it's so difficult. It's just cultural. I don't know. And yet, I was at an offsite with one of our companies, and I went to go to the restroom before dinner, and there was a guy on the table with an iron taking every crease out of the tablecloth to help set up the most phenomenal meal. And I said to myself, why can't Italians bring the same attention to detail to food and design to running things? I don't know why. But there are some bigger forces there that are the reality of the bigger cultures that you're in.
Hi. So When bridging talent that comes from disciplinary areas, so from creative to development, etc., also from Fortune 500s to maybe startups, and they all bridge into one common company. I recall you mentioning bridging policies and procedures, making sure that they're aligned, not necessarily just on paper, but in practice through the offices, for example, whether that be closed off or through an open desk structure. When in that environment and all those people come together, what are the best ways to spur engagement not only in the company, but through customer engagement and how they treat their customers?
So the question is more how you get in.
The question more so is when you have all these different types of people in one company.
I got that. Yeah.
How do you keep them aligned on the policies, procedures, and vision?
Well, I think the best thing you can do is, and I think this is always true as a CEO, is to have a clear direction and a clear set of priorities and focus that everybody understands. And that as a CEO, you communicate around those so everyone aligns and unifies around these are the 3 or 4 things. There can't be 15 again. These are 3 or 4 things that we really have to get done right. And we're going to communicate on these things. Everyone needs to drop whatever else they're doing to make sure we do these things right. And to have that be crystal clear to people, I think can unify people around a goal that's meaningful.
Hi, I'm Clarissa from Malaysia.
Okay.
I was just wondering, what do you think is the most challenging thing about creating and maintaining culture within the company?
Well, to me, I haven't created one from scratch, by and large. I've always dealt with, I've tended to be in problem situations. And to me, that's the most difficult, is I think creating would be a lot of fun. If you could go from scratch and write down, this is really the kind of company we want to be. I mean, I look at the young companies in the Valley, the young big companies, and it's pretty fresh, And then I look at some of the more staid companies. I call them legacy companies, and I've been involved with them, and it's sad to say. Those cultures get stale and people become entitled, and all this bad stuff can happen over time. So to me, keeping that company fresh and keeping a culture fresh and innovative is the challenge. It's not starting, it's taking what you have and getting people, especially when you have thousands of employees, getting them to move in a new direction, because you can't just replace them all.
Hi, one question. I've seen a lot of companies in the Valley with very successful cultures, and they go out and decide they need to be in another technology area, or they go and they will hire a lot of people from HP or Microsoft or pick it. So there's a big influx of people from another company. And often then they bring the culture with them. And how do you keep the culture of the original company from diverging when you have so many people from company X joining?
Yeah, I mean, it's as I said, a culture has a certain potency to it. If the culture is not very potent, it's going to be easily subject to change. If you as a CEO are driving a potent culture that you believe is central to what you do, people aren't going to come in and change it very well. And that could be a problem, right? Because maybe it needs to change. And that's why, as I said, at HP, and even Microsoft, some of the other places that have strong cultures, outsiders really struggle when they come in. But the outsiders don't change the company. Does that make sense? Is that true? Last question? Keep going. Okay, I'll keep going. We're going.
Hi, this is Rohit. I had some question related to, you clarified over there. So you said you were in Microsoft and the culture over there was not in line with the way they were targeting every segment. So what actions did you take to try to change that culture to come in line with the...
Yeah. Let me give you I'll give you a good example. I mean, again, this is a big company thing, but think about this as a notion. So we decided, this has been well documented in books and stuff, and it was my group, we decided to enter the game console business with Xbox, right? And we had a meet. I'll never forget this. This was in the Wall Street Journal. We had this. In fact, Robbie Bach, who worked for me, who ran it, just wrote a book and talked about this meeting, where we sat with Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, and we had a big battle over what it would take to get the product done, because we had decided that, hey, this is a completely different world than what we got to hire people who do who write content. We have to have studios. I mean, this is never going to fit in what we do at Microsoft. So we want to build a fairly distinct operation of studios and focus on Xbox. And there was a lot of resistance to that, to the point the team said, look, if we don't do that, we're not going to do it. It was this really tough meeting. And we, to the credit of Bill and Steve, they said, okay, we'll do it. And Xbox was successful. And that was something where we had to do something dramatically different from a cultural perspective to recruit and retain people who think about game content, first-party games, very different than what we did in Windows, right? So that's an example of things you do. I think you talk about your culture. You say, these are the things that are important to me. You be very, very clear about it. You talk about it every chance you get. These are the 5 things that we're going to have a performance culture, blah, blah, blah. And then you reinforce those each and every day. When someone gives a presentation, they say, we had a good quarter. You say, well, why do you think it's good? And test people, and you push, you just, it moves along inch by inch, slowly. There's usually, the Xbox example is a rare case where you can do something like that. But it just reinforces the culture's critical. I think we would have failed if we tried to build a gaming console business in the traditional Microsoft environment.
Yes, hello. My name is Olga Media. I would like to know, by your opinion, not just media, what has to say, what would be your best achievements and perhaps, and why, and what could be done better?
Okay. So to me, the best experience was, again, building products that nobody cares about anymore. But when I ran the printer business at HP, I mean, there was an example where we were nowhere in the business. We had 1% market share. We picked this transformation to a new printing technologies, and we invested and we ran it that hard, and we went from 1% to 50% market share in about 3 years. Phenomenal success. I mean, those were just incredible times, building that business. So I don't know. I think most people would acknowledge that experience. I didn't do it alone. There were a lot of other people, but it was a great time and a great experience. The most challenging one that if I were to look back on and say what would I have done most differently was probably when I was CEO at SGI. That was a very hard transformation, very hard situation. I didn't realize how hard it was when I entered it, and I would have actually been more radical in terms of change than I was, just because the industry had passed it by, and that was tough.
Hi. So my question is, when you're implementing performance culture, how do you avoid severe conflicts like that potentially can tear the team apart? So I think it might be easier for the C-level hiring people to you influence or educate the new hire about the culture. But in terms of C-level, I know CEO and CTO fight all the time. How do you avoid when everyone is completely tell the truth and completely rely on the external feedback and telling the brutal truth? How do you avoid conflict?
Well, I go back to my being hard-headed and soft-hearted. Is I think you have to say the facts. But you have to do it with respect. I mean, there's a difference to say we're failing in this area and saying we're failing in this area because you guys are a bunch of idiots, right? So you have to bring people together to the real solution and the real problem, and be, as a CEO, you've got to be the leader in making sure that you go through that process, but do it in a way that's constructive and productive. And there's nothing wrong with yelling. I mean, that's part, again, and I mean yelling in the sense that there's nothing wrong with disagreeing and having hard conversations. It's just how you resolve those and how you move to a solution that takes leadership. That's what leadership does. Some people, I know, do that incredibly well, and some people don't. And so if you're a CEO, be the one that does it incredibly well. Engage people, work as a team, keep people focused on the facts, and let opinions flow, but then make decisions. I mean, bring clarity. There's a series of things that you can do to make that work. And again, I just think too, accountability is important. Remember what I told you that CEO said, I start with the point of view that it's my fault. And that's very empowering to people. When they come in a room to solve a problem and you know that the CEO owns that problem more than anybody and isn't looking for someone to blame, is looking for how the team can come together to solve a problem.
Hi. I wanted to know what you think about CEOs who create a culture or encourage people to do things that might be considered deceitful or borderline fraud. And an example, this week we saw in the news the story of Just Mayo, where the CEO was encouraging employees and contractors to buy lots of their product and ask for it, and then like throw it away or eat it to make it look and create a false sense of the demand for the product so he could falsely inflate the value to investors. There must have been employees who were upset about it. In the news, they were interviewed and said, yes, we didn't like doing this, but we did it anyway. What do you advise employees in a situation where they are in a culture where they don't agree with their CEO or what's being done?
Well, you know, that's a pure failure of leadership. It's a pure failure of the CEO. So, I mean, I would start at the top, and so there should be no tolerance for that. A board of directors should have weren't doing their job to have these things gone on. So I think employees have to communicate. I mean, I don't think you can just say, this is happening, it's not my fault, or decide. I think ultimately you have to find the most constructive and effective way to share your view. And again, I think a good organization, that's part of the role that people like board members. I mean, I've been in situations where we've had to make a CEO change as a board member, and many times I felt, we weren't as connected with the team as we needed to be, because we would have been more aware of problems earlier. It's so everyone's got to do their job. And the board has to do their job if the CEO is misbehaving, and the employees have to do their job. And I know that's easier said than done, but I don't see any other choice. If a team is truly a team, and if people want to be respected as contributors, they can't close their eyes to inappropriate behavior. You just can't. It's just unfortunately part of being a professional in this industry.
Yep. Hi. Name is Benito. Thank you very much for being here. You talked about it a little bit throughout the course of your talk, but I was wondering, aside from the examples of leadership you gave in terms of taking the economy flight and having an open office and not putting everyone into their own silos, are there other instances or ways in which you recommend to formally or informally communicate your company's culture to new employees in particular?
Well, I would say, first of all, that you can't, the issue is not, because remember I talk about drift and all these other aspects. You got to be communicating and reinforcing all the time to all the company, new employees. There are, I think, programs that people can put in place to help provide tools. I mean, there are tools today that can help people build a culture. And so, it's not just posters in the hallway. I mean, I want to just be clear about that. I mean, I'm not against posters, but I've not seen any posters that really tell the true richness. Culture is a rich thing. and it's multidimensional and takes conversation that goes all around this thing. And so it takes getting out. When I was a CEO, I always felt that being out with the team is essential to find opportunities to constantly reinforce where you want things to go from a cultural perspective. One last question, I'm told. Do we have one more?
Hey, Richard, my name's Chris. I just moved here from out of state recently, and I'm a self-made entrepreneur. I've done everything myself. I've had no formal training. I come from a place where, as my management style, I always want my employees to be friends. Like, I don't draw a line between, a manager and employee can't be friends outside of work. I love to take my whole business out to lunch, have them integrate, have them become related, and it's always worked really well for me. Moving here, talking to people that work for some of the bigger tech companies here, I see that some of them have a culture of climbing the ladder and throwing people under the bus and doing that. They don't really encourage being related with your fellow employees and stuff. And I see really big companies that have done really well apparently with this culture. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I try not to take too long to answer this because it's interesting. I mentioned earlier about the culture, kind of the macro culture, and there's a company that sits in the macro culture. And you're describing, I think, something that is a little bit about I'm just going to frankly say is part of the culture of Silicon Valley, in my experience, because I also grew up, I did most of my HP career was in Idaho. And we were just like, we'd climb any wall together, and it was phenomenal. Then I came here, and I find out, people don't think the same way. There isn't that same, partially because people are commuting more. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons for it. It's not a criticism. I'll give you a funny story. I was at an Italian event, and there was a guy I had hired at HP, to a factory in HP. We worked together. He went to Idaho, and he just thought coming to the U.S., this is like America. It's amazing. He went back to Italy, came back to the Bay Area, all excited, ready to go. He and his wife moved into a house here. He went over to the neighbor, knocked on the door, and says, "Oh, I'm Luigi. I am your new neighbor." And the guy goes, "And your point is?" So I personally believe it's a little tougher here, is to your point. And so I don't know what advice to give you. I think it's, again, the broader culture can impact the company culture you want to build. So if you want to build a company culture that has people be friends and spend time together, that might not be the right thing to do. I don't know. You have to rely on different ways of bringing people together. I hate to be cynical, but you can't change the world, even though sometimes we like to think we can. As entrepreneurs, you have to work with what you have. Okay, that's it.
We'd like to thank Rick for spending time with us tonight. I'm going to give him the classic Idea to IPO coffee mug.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. I'll clear off.
So I hope you enjoyed tonight's program, brought to you by Idea to IPO and the Commonwealth Club. I want to thank again Rick Belluzzo and all of you for coming. And now this meeting is adjourned.